Hello, everyone. Welcome to our office hour number 41, dedicated to CSDM 4.0, what's new, and a general overview. My name is Charles Rayburn. I'm a Senior Manager of Customer Success here, hosting and facilitating the office hours. For those who are new to the office hour format, we talk about for the first 30 minutes, topics related to what you guys as customers have asked in customer success meetings, as well as just some of the feedback. But the whole goal is to ensure that the subject matter expert that we invited has a chance to talk to us about the best practices and guiding factors related to that topic in the first 30 minutes. And the remaining 30 minutes is open to any types of conversations related to that topic. So questions, answers, things like that. You can pull yourself off of mute and either ask the question that way or go ahead and type in the question into the chat window and I'll ask that on your behalf. For those who are listening to the video, if you have any questions related to the topic, go ahead and just post a question inside the community where we post the videos on YouTube, and then we'll try to get that information back over to you and try to provide an answer from that as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Scott Lim, who's going to be our senior subject matter expert today on CSDM. Scott, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Charles. So today we're going to talk about CSDM 4.0. And as you're probably aware, it hasn't officially been released yet. It'll be released as a white paper here in October. No specific date right now, but it will be October. Because it hasn't been released yet, then obviously we're talking about future statements, so our safe harbor notice, because we're going to be talking about some future elements here. My name is Scott Lim. I'm the product manager responsible for the Common Service Data Model and Digital Enterprise Fabric, which essentially means I'm responsible for the design, the vision, and the roadmap. We are going to talk about what is new in CSDM. I'm going to hop around with a few pieces because I have a lot of material I want to share with you. I want to make sure we hit on all the big pieces. So that said, for those of you who are familiar with the Common Service Data Model, then you know with the 3.0 release, we introduced the foundation domain into the concept of the Common Service Data Model. So we have the 4 domains that represent how we group data inside of the data model. And when we look at how we function, we think of a lot of our activities based off of a design, build, run type of a flow inside of our organizations. And if we look at design, build, run and relate that to Common Service Data Model, then we got design nailed. We named it the same piece. From a run perspective, that is our managed technical services. But a gap has always been there when we come to build. What do we see when it comes to build? We have the things that we're designing, we have the things that we've implemented and are operational, but what about those things that are currently being built? So that's the new addition from Common Service Data Model. We've added in a new domain called build. And these are the development details of our digital products. And like the design domain, these are not operational CIs. So let's look at what we mean by the CSDM4 and just jump right in it. The assumption, of course, is that you are familiar with the Common Service Data Model and the 3.0 model. So you will notice the differences as soon as we show. And there it is. This is the Common Service Data Model 4.0. As you'll notice, the new domain, build domain, is included, and that includes a new class in the CMDB called SDLC component. So the software development lifecycle component. I'll explain that piece here in a moment. As for the foundation domain, because it's foundational, we've moved it as the underlying layer, underlying all of these pieces. So there's our foundation and the objects represented here at the bottom. So we now have 5 domains. We've got the foundation domain that you are familiar with, the design domain that you should also be familiar with, the new build domain, and then moving into the managed technical services, and then the sell consume. So the large addition to Common Service Data Model 4.0 is this build domain and this new class called SDLC component. Now, SDLC component isn't going to be available immediately. So it's not in the Rome family release. It's going to be part of the plugin that is available through the store for CMDB updates. And the timeline of giving this particular table is going to be roughly November, December timeframe. So that's when you'll be able to see it in your instances and be able to see what SDLC component can do for you. But let's talk about what that means and some other pieces as it relates to the Common Service Data Model 4.0. So I have a few topics to go through that we're going to walk through some differences here with the 4.0 version. First up is that new build domain. So again, this is the developmental details of our digital products. If you recall, the design was the design of our digital products. So now this is the developmental details of our digital products. And like design, these are not operational. So you're not going to use this object in incident at all. You're not going to use this object in change necessarily. This is going to be a bridge into DevOps. So this is where we're going to be able to hook in from our DevOps config, from our Swiegel acquisition that we call CDM, which is a management of configurations and the creation of configurations. So those pieces are going to relate to this new domain and to this particular configuration item. The problem that we're trying to solve for, among many, is a particular scenario. So let's take a scenario where we've recently released into the wild onto one of our application services, a new configuration of that application service. We've done that obviously through our DevOps process and released a new config onto our application service. And suddenly there's an alert on our application service. We notice that there's an issue going on. Now, as we look at that application service, because we now have visibility into this build domain and this SDLC component and the activities of DevOps, we can see that this application service had a recent release to it. We can see the configuration of this application service now. We can see the configuration of this application service 2 hours ago. And now we can start to delve into this alert and see, is the issue related to this change in config? So instead of the old days of calling 911 and bringing everyone and their uncle onto a call to see, okay, who did something? Now we know what the something potentially is immediately, and now can start to resolve it. And so if it is related to a recent config, then we can go ahead and say, all right, we need an incident. We need it related to this particular config. Let's do a feedback loop back to the developers and say, hey, there's an issue with this particular config, and we can rapidly fix it. So that visibility, that rapid insight into what's going on from a build perspective is what we're trying to help solve for. And it's going to give us the ability to rapidly improve or see issues before they become major issues. For those of us on Facebook, then you recall this week's issues with Facebook. This is one of those elements that we're confident, among other elements that we provide within ServiceNow, that would have helped out in that situation. So what we can do with an SDLC component. This is, again, a new class in the CMDB. So it is in the CMDB. And it, again, represents the software development lifecycle effort. It is going to be tied to an application model. If it's an application-related effort, it's going to be tied to a technical service model if it's a infrastructure effort. So there's two types, essentially, of an SDLC component. It's application related or it's infrastructure related. When we start talking about application examples, we can finally identify the pieces and parts of a business application. So our business application being broken up into microservices and APIs, or however the individual development becomes, by each of those objects as SDLC components, and then be able to relate that into our DevOps pipeline to see what's actually being done related to those individual components and its release cycle. As they are released, each of those components have their own application service. So I know a while ago we've had the questions of what do we do about microservices? And we've said, well, they are their own application services, and collectively they report up to whatever the business application is that they function for. Well, now we've got the SDLC component to give the details of the fact that it's broken up into these pieces and parts. So what does that start to look like when we build out using the common service data model? From a design perspective, we've got our business capability and our business application. In this scenario, we have online sales management. From there, we know that our online sales management is actually made up of 4 components, 4 pieces that come together and represent our online sales management. We've got our online order manager, and then we've got some various conversion pieces in the customer manager that come together that actually represent our business application. So we don't have to create a business application for each and every application service. That's what we've done quite a bit in the past. Now we can take that lone business application and break it up into its components. And each of those components will then be able to identify its pieces. So these components, again, represent the build team efforts on the individual components of that application. So as we release, each of those components will have their own instance, their own application service. And as you understand the definition of an application service, it can be based off of environment, dev, QA, and prod. So that does mean that a single SDLC component could have multiple application services based off of how it's been deployed. So those are the pieces where we're now able to get a bit more granular based off of the scenarios where customers have wanted to get granular. The big key here is there's no rush to use SDLC component. We have many customers that were already creating their own customization to have what is essence a SDLC component inside of their systems, or they were taking business applications and they were making them layered that were really components. So now we've actually included it into the platform, so we don't have to utilize the customizations that many customers were doing. So again, SDLC component, the pieces and parts of a business application, each of them are deployed into their own application services. If there is a dependency hierarchy, because they all depend on one particular component as the primary piece of that business application, then those dependency relationships can still be created and understood. And from there, however you do your hosting, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, identifying where that hosting is and the other pieces and parts of that application service, who's responsible for the managing and maintaining of those infrastructure pieces, and then what's the business that depends on that application to function and utilize that from a consumption perspective. So this is the new SDLC component. It's the largest piece of the new CSDM 4.0, and it gives us that ability again to identify the pieces of a business application that are individually developed. Next piece I want to get into is service portfolio. So service portfolio is a piece, obviously a critical element of service portfolio management that was rewritten in the New York timeframe. And as you are aware, in previous releases and versions of CSDM and with the service portfolio management capabilities, that service portfolio is a hierarchy of business services. Except now in the Rome release, it's no longer just business services. Now we can finally relate technical services to that service portfolio. So you can have a service portfolio that's made up of both business services and technical services. Previously, there was a technical limitation that would not permit the ability to identify a technical service as part of a service portfolio. So that has been removed. And now you can reference the technical services to a service portfolio. Now, where that shows up visually is in Service Owner Workspace, but unfortunately, that will not be a piece that you can see in Rome timeframe for Service Owner Workspace. Instead, the Service Portfolio Management team is working on a new workspace called Digital Portfolio Management that they expect to release early next year. And that's going to be the new way to start visualizing how all of our services and applications and products in general start coming together. So with that, again, if you have Service Owner Workspace today and you enjoy Service Owner Workspace and you want to tie your technical services to your service portfolios in Service Owner Workspace, that will not be visible yet, not until Digital Portfolio Management Workspace is released early next year. Next piece I want to talk about business services. So anyone who wanted to populate a business service inside of the CMDB and based off of Common Service Data Model recommendations, it was in the table called CMDB CI service or general service. Previously in the old days, that was called business service. But one of the problems with that table is there are other tables extended from it. So it becomes an element where we end up sharing the service table with both business services and everything else. As you are familiar with in past releases, we have created a dedicated technical service to align with the dedicated application service table. And then of course, service offering is its own dedicated table. All of them extend from the core CMDB CI service table. So with that, what we do in the future, you no longer need to put business services into CMDB CI service. We now have a dedicated table for business services, just as we do for technical services, application services, and service offerings. So it extends from the core service table. All of the data that we have in these extended tables still show in the core service table. So from a reporting function, it's still quite valuable to focus on the core service table as all the objects will be represented there, but they will be identified by their own classes as the differentiator. Now, some of you also may be familiar with the attribute that we utilized that is the service classification to identify, is this an application service, technical service, or business service? And that's a legacy attribute that we've had to use because for many years we've had to share the core service table. So how do we differentiate that the configuration item, the service that I'm looking at right now, is technical versus application versus business? And so we always use that attribute. The long-term roadmap is to get rid of that attribute, so that we will have these dedicated tables, and those tables and those classifications of those tables tell us the type of CI it is, the type of service, as opposed to using the attribute. But it's a legacy attribute that we have to continue to use until we get everyone functioning on the dedicated tables. Now, with the new business service table, in the Rome release, we've created the table, but there is absolutely no rush to migrate into using this table. The reason for that is we don't have a migration mechanism that's been created. That's going to be part of the San Diego release, I believe. And that's where, if you currently have your business services in the core service table, there'll be a mechanism to move those into the dedicated table, and along with everything else that might be associated to those particular records. So we have the new table primarily for new customers that want to use it, or the customers that want to get a head start, but there is absolutely no rush to migrate. You don't have to use the new table. It is just there. Sometimes in ServiceNow, when we move towards a new way of doing things, it takes a few releases to get completely there. So right now we have the table, but we don't have a mechanism to move you from the old table to the new just yet. So if you try, you're pretty much on your own. Business process and continuity. So going to the foundation domain, we have business process. We actually wanted to get this into CSDM 3, and we missed it by, I want to say, 3 weeks. Whenever we talk about a capability inside of CSDM 3, we want to actually make sure that that capability will somewhat soon exist in one way or another inside of the platform. And what we did is we gave the business process class inside of the CMDB, its functionality, to our governance risk compliance team, and more specifically the business continuity team, so that they could manage that object and provide very specific capability around it. And they just weren't ready yet. So now with the Rome release, there's been a lot of activity and a lot of capability that has been added with the function and use of business process as it relates to risk and business continuity. So now is a great time to start bragging about business process and identifying it as a foundational element. Now, you may have heard me say that this is a class inside of the CMDB, and you might be thinking to yourself, hey, Scott, shouldn't those be up here where all the lines are and boxes, so we can draw lines and boxes all around a business process? We could, except our vision of a business process moves beyond the CMDB. So those boxes up there are really classes inside of the CMDB. We want to think of a business process beyond just classes in the CMDB. And that's where we can include any element in the platform that could be part of a process or impact a process. For example, locations or people or documentation or groups. So things that aren't classes in the CMDB that are also part of an overall business process. And business processes, we can look from the 30,000 foot level and see holistically the processes that our business performs to be in business and function, or we can take a business process and make it part of a particular service, and how does that process work within that service. Any of those layers can be done. We want to make sure we got good visibility, and we can identify any object that becomes an element of that process, not just CIs in the CMDB. So that's why we didn't try to put it in some sort of hierarchy on one of these elements, whether it be in design or someplace else, because we didn't want to limit to just the CMDB objects. We want this to be able to use beyond the CMDB, so elements now throughout the whole platform could be identified as part of a particular process. So this functionality and added functionality is part of what's provided through our risk as well as business continuity teams. So when you install risk or business continuity, you'll see that the business process class gets modified and a lot more capability and functions are added on to the ability to use a business process.
I had a quick question pop up there, Scott, from Johnny Ortiz. Will the same be done to simplify the application service tables? There are currently 3 tables for application services.
So the same being done as what being done?
Johnny, if you want to take yourself off of mute really quick.
Yeah, so it's a comment based on the business service being moved down to become its own table unique under the service classifications. You listed the CMDB service discovered as an application service table there, but there's 3 today. I believe service auto and service manual also exists there. So I didn't know if there was consideration to consolidate that into one table rather than
No.
it being 3 separate tables. Okay.
They'll always be separate. And the reason why they're separate is the functionality that's needed to manage those application services based off of the type is why they're in those dedicated tables. So one application service type is based off of tag based, another is based off of service mapping, and then another is based off of dynamic. So those dedicated tables are specific to the method that the application service will be managed. There is an application service hierarchy. So there's a top application service table, and then all of those others extend off of it. And so I represent application service here holistically, as opposed to trying to choose one versus the 4, but they aren't going to be consolidated because of underneath technically we have the mechanisms to manage them unique and need those tables to be unique in order to function in those management methods. I hope that helps.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. All right, so that wraps up business process. So this one, all right, so I'm excited about all this stuff, but this one is one I've been working on for what seems like my entire career, locations. And locations drive me nuts. So if you have problems with locations like I have problems with locations, then chances are you've got multiple sources of truth to populate your locations, which just gives you that huge list of locations. And when you have multiple sources, chances are you have the same location in there listed multiple times, but spelled differently or different naming or decided what someone calls it from this direction versus what they call the same item from another direction. And so you get all of these objects and it just gets to be a dirty table. And managing that is just hellacious. You get duplicates, you get a long list of records, and how do you know what's true and what's wrong? And working and managing and maintaining this is just trouble from the beginning. So if you have multiple sources of truth, trying to load your locations based off of coming in from a people perspective or from an asset perspective, chances are you're going to get collisions in locations, and managing that is just trouble. And so I thought to myself, what if we treat these like assets? And then going back on my career and how I've worked with multiple organizations, coming up with solutions to manage locations, what if we helped out and helped manage locations better? So in our Rome release, we have added some new attributes to help move towards a capability of managing locations, just as if we might be managing assets. The first attribute we have created is source ID. Where did this come from? Similar to the source ID that we have on our hardware or our computer systems. Where did this come from? SMS? Oh, wow, shows my age. Did this come from SCCM? Or did this come from a manual entry? What is the actual source? So this becomes that choice list to say, where did this come from? So we know where that data is at. And if we do any sort of an investigation of where we've got the good data versus bad data, or the preferred data versus non-preferred data, is there a particular source that becomes more and more of an issue? And we can eventually fix it at the source. And the reason why I say fix it at the source is we might think, okay, we have this long list of location. We'll just delete the ones that we don't like. Well, the problem is if you have a source, it's going to recreate it. You can't delete it. It's going to recreate it. So it becomes a perpetual issue of having these objects that we don't necessarily want or share inside of the location table. The next attribute we added is location type. So we want to categorize these locations because ultimately we want to move towards a hierarchy as opposed to a very, very long list of locations. So with that, categorizing each location entry, is this the region, the country, the state of providence, city, a site, is a building or structure, and then get down into floor, room, etc. This will help us consolidate the various references of location inside of the platform so that we can have consistency with a core table. Now you'll notice here building and structure. That's actually my favorite choice in the whole list. The rest of them are pretty standard. You understand that. But for example, I've got one of our customers, University of Notre Dame, and they wanted to make sure that they could identify the parking lot and this light pole, very specific light pole in a very specific spot of the parking lot because they got a piece of networking equipment sitting on top of it. So making sure that we looked at locations holistically and looked at the various types holistically. And so now having a choice list so that we can categorize each of those entries and also do some rules around those in the future. Yes, you have an asset, and that asset is also a CI. And so the location is a shared attribute, but you're not going to be able to choose region for your location. You have to choose something at a minimum that gets us to an address so we can find it. So maybe that's site or building structure. So those type of rules you can start to put in once you have some categorization of the types of locations that exist. We added manage by group. You might remember this from the CMDB. So we're going to be consistent with some of the terms and the data elements that we use throughout the platform, not just in the CMDB. So we added manage by group to identify who is responsible for managing that particular location record. Next up, we get to validation from a duplicate perspective. So now is where we start to manage the duplicate. We added the ability to identify that a record is a duplicate versus the primary. So there's a flag to say this is a duplicate. And once you say it's a duplicate, you have to identify what its primary is. And now we can start to filter out all the noise inside of the location table because of the pieces that we know are duplicates that we don't want displayed or utilized inside of the repository. And the last piece we added was lifecycle status. And this one also I'm extremely excited about. And going back to University of Notre Dame, they wanted to identify, because they're building a lot of new things, and they want to know that they can have this location identified as something that's currently in design, it's being built, but it's not yet out there and operational, versus the end of life, we just moved out of that office building. So we're no longer in it and it's not active. So if anything shows up at it, something's going wrong. So using lifecycle, similar to how we're going to be using it in the CMDB, being able to use it on location records as well. So in the Rome release, we've added the attributes. In future releases, we'll start to do management around those attributes. Until then, you're happy to go out and start using those and create your own management around those attributes. But at least we have a standard for the attributes. They're in there for you to use, as opposed to us coming to you to say, here are some best practices, but you have to create it on your own. Now, at least the data attributes are there for you to start functioning with.
I had a quick question pop up too there, Scott, from Juan. Are the locations dependent with hierarchy, such as you can't have a room without a floor or a building without an address?
That's the direction that we want to go. So we don't today have any requirements in. That's something we'll do in the future when we put management around it. But if you wanted to go ahead and put requirements in there and build those rules, have at it. That's why we put the attributes in, so you can start with a head start of how you want to manage the data so that you are making sure that the data is green and not dirty. All right, next up, I want to talk about lifecycle. Since we talked about it on locations, this is a big effort. And this has been going on since 2018. This is how long we have been working on lifecycle. So the problem here, states and statuses, as you look at assets, as you look at CIs, there's no less than 9 attributes that help to identify state or status across assets, CMDB, product models, contracts, and they don't speak to each other, or they don't have the same language with each other. And the values that are in them aren't consistent with how we work today and how lifecycle is meant to function. And then add to that, because of all of those issues, we found in our research that over half of our clients are actually customizing the out-of-the-box states and statuses. So it makes it extremely difficult for us to provide any sort of functionality because there's no consistency in how the data is being used. So that's where we wanted to focus on how can we fix this issue. And again, we've got legacy attributes. So how do we move forward? And really moving forward is creating 2 new attributes, lifecycle stage and lifecycle stage status. The combination of those 2 equal the actual lifecycle. So instead of trying to fix the attributes that are currently there, it was better to create 2 new ones. And that's exactly what we did. We started this several releases ago. So the attributes were introduced several releases ago, but with each release, we've added functionality so that as soon as we're ready to utilize these attributes, then everything should be there to help move forward. The other piece of this is we wanted to make sure we had the right lifecycle value based off of the object that you're looking at. There's a big difference between a physical object and a logical object. You're not going to be sending to property disposition your logical services or application services or those types of scenarios. Those are more physical items. And then you're not necessarily going to be developing your server or your PC. You're going to be focused on that with your application services, etc. So we want to make sure that we are having the right object for the right use. Also, because of the customization that we saw many of our clients doing, you can't edit the choices. We need to have consistency, and we need to make sure that the choices that are there are the only ones that we need to be concerned about as we build capabilities on top of these process flows of lifecycle. And lastly, there's no rush to migrate to utilize these two new attributes. We're introducing this now so you're aware of it, but likely from a San Diego and Tokyo timeframe, there's going to be a larger desire and requirement to utilize these new attributes. We're letting you know now so that you get kind of a head start of what they are and how they function. But let's look at it from a process standpoint, depending on the object that we're looking at. So if you look at product models and you use product models, maybe you're big into asset, and just so you know, product models are going to be big outside of asset very, very soon from a common service data model and a now data model perspective. So product models previously had one single attribute for status, and one of the choices in it was sold, and that obviously wasn't useful. So if you look at product models and how we manage our products, our digital products, it starts with ideation and then move into design and then operational and end of life. And it might go from ideation straight to operational if we don't have any design activities that are needed. So this becomes the life cycle of a product. So the bold portions are our life cycle stage, and then the elements underneath of each bold piece is our lifecycle stage status. And now this gives us visibility into the overall lifecycle of a product, including our digital products. As we move this into hardware, then let's look at the overall process. It still begins with ideation. We want to keep ideation on product models. We don't want to create assets and CIs just because we have an idea. That becomes overburdened because what if we don't go forward with that idea? So let's keep our ideas on our product models. And if we move forward and we're going to purchase or we're going to develop something, then we can go ahead and create the right object at the right time. So from a hardware perspective, we have an idea where it's under evaluation, we're piloting it, we decide, yeah, we want this in our environment. So now we'll have an asset record with purchase. We'll put that into inventory. When we go to deploy, then we've got those particular details related to it. When it's operational, we have our particular details. After operational, it's either defective, missing, it goes back into inventory so we can reuse it, or it gets end of life. And of course, there's more details in end of life to manage how we take care of hardware versus what we would do with more of the logical elements. So this is where we see disposed and donated that you wouldn't expect to see as a choice on an application service. Now, as you are aware of today, when you create an asset, you're simultaneously creating a configuration item and vice versa. In the distant future, we will stop that. It will be an asset, and as soon as we go to deploy, that's when we will create the configuration item. Not only is it good just for the process, there's actually a tremendous impact on the platform by always creating assets and CIs at the same time. So this fixes an issue when you do mass loads into the platform where we have to validate both sides and create both sides. We will stop that in the distant future. When I say distant, I'm not even talking in 2023. So it'll be distant once we get everyone using the new lifecycle stage or lifecycle stage status. That's when we'll start to optimize the process flow, and no longer will we create assets and CIs at the same time. How does this look from a logical standpoint? Now you start to see that differentiation. If this is logical, then I'm not even having asset in place here because we're talking about configuration items logical. So that's likely the services or the applications. So I still have ideation on a product model. If I'm going to buy it or if I'm going to develop it, then I'm going to move down into design. Chartered means I've got funding for it. Design is I'm actually trying to draw out what I think it will be. Build is that's DevOps. They're doing their work. They'll go to deploy it and test it. And then it becomes operational and eventually end of life with retired or obsolete. Now, what we can do now that customers are going to be using these particular flows and these particular statuses instead of the legacy is we can provide better capability. One of the things that is part of our Roam Plus effort is a new capability for the CMDB, which is CMDB Data Manager. And it's policy-based managing RCIs based off of these lifecycle stage and stage status. One of the initial efforts that was created in Data Manager was the ability to manage those logical CIs, the ones that are created by cloud that only live for a short period of time, but they're no longer needed ever again inside of the CMDB. What can we do to get rid of those objects so they don't cluster up our CMDB? By using these lifecycle stage statuses, we have a policy that looks at the CIs within particular classes to see that they're at end of life. And if they're at end of life and they're part of a particular class, then we can set up a workflow that is to archive or delete, depending on your business rules, those CIs automatically. So having these lifecycle stages and statuses and being very prescriptive in how we manage them and not allowing any variations allows us to provide capability and automation onto the platform. And the very first capability is that seem-to-be data manager. It will require the use of these attributes. Because it requires the use of these attributes, then we've provided some mapping capabilities so you can start to use them sooner than later. Other elements, we have the same choices for documents or same capability on documents, but very specific choices are available. We have, as I mentioned, for locations earlier that brought into this discussion, what the lifecycle stage and stage statuses are for locations. Now, I mentioned the mapping. So one of the things we did in the previous release was the mapping of the legacy attributes to the lifecycle attributes. So what did it equal previously, whether it was operational status or install status or hardware status? What does that equal in the new attributes? So we did this mapping, and it's part of a capability that can be turned on and enabled. What we did in the Rome release was reverse mapping. So that's where we had to finish this effort off. And so now, if you enable the use of these attributes, then you will have them populated and mapped from their legacy cousins. But if you start using the new attributes and make an update using the new attributes as opposed to the legacy, we'll do a reverse map into those legacy attributes as well. The reason for that is highly likely not everything you have that's dependent on those legacy attributes will migrate to the use of those new attributes very quickly. It could be reports using those legacy attributes or other capabilities, third-party products, etc., using those legacy attributes. So with our Rome release, we now have backwards mapping. So we have forward mapping and backwards mapping of the attributes. And as you can see from this sheet here, what those values are and where we map back from. So we've been working on this for many years. It's taken multiple releases to slowly get the material in there. We're confident that with our Rome release, the functionality works. With our San Diego release, we expect other business units to start using and managing those new attributes. Until then, it is still optional to use. Unless you want to use the new CMDB data manager, you will be required to enable these lifecycle attributes in order to utilize the new CMDB data manager.
There was a quick question that popped up. Will the phases under each box be entities? Example, pre-allocated captured as an entity in financial realm? This was from Molly.
Allocated. So it's going back to hardware, I believe. So under purchase, it's on order and pre-allocated. Those map current capability out of asset management. So we're not trying to sway away from the current capability too much of asset management. So the lifecycle stage is purchased. The lifecycle stage status is pre-allocated based off of the definitions from ITS management.
Okay, and then one more question. This probably goes a little bit further back, but this was from Nilesh. Will location contain slot number and chassis for server?
Oh, I love that question. So now you're seeing the value of what I was trying to get at. So I say etc. because it's now a choice list. We can go much deeper. And being able to do that from a server room perspective, the choice list can be added to, and you can certainly get to those particular depths. And what that enables us to do, for those of you that haven't worked with location, this is a hierarchy. So when I choose a room, then I'm also choosing simultaneously based off of a parent-child hierarchy. I get the floor, I get the building structure if I'm using it. And you don't have to have all of these in every layer. But I also get the site, the city, the province. I get it all the way up. So I know all of the details without having to enter it in separately on multiple objects. So when we start talking about the data center and you're talking about zones or you're talking about a rack and where you're in a rack, you certainly can go to that depth and have those details in here. Now, there are other scenarios that I have seen when it starts getting to a rack, and what we're considering from a telecom perspective and introducing new functions and features into the CMDB. And we're not going to release the areas inside of a rack as necessarily as a CMDB CI object, but we might identify those as a record because they could have multiple pieces to it. So yes, you could use the location type and get there and have that hierarchy, and that would be a simple, easy way to do it. And as soon as you need to mature into like a telecom management capability based off of telecom standards, and there's quite a few out there, but a big one that we're trying to follow, then you can migrate as needed. But you can certainly extend this to your heart's content to get inside of a room.
Great. Those are the only questions. Keep going, Scott. Thanks.
All right. Product models. So this is kind of a warning. I mentioned earlier, product models are very important for asset management. And it's going to be important for us as well. It's going to be important very, very soon. And so we want to make sure we identify these digital products and we start utilizing them. And I'll give you some visibility of what we're doing in the future and how we're going to help you manage these in the future. These digital products, if you focus from an IT for IT perspective, which of course we have a large focus on, then we're identifying those elements that identify what it is we want to sell or consume. And it can be bundles. So what does it come together to be an overall object that we have and sell? And sell can be where we consume it internally. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are selling those externally of our organization, but it can represent both. And with that, we found an opportunity to utilize a unifying object, which is the product model. And you're familiar with product models from an asset perspective. We got hardware models, software models. From a customer service management perspective, we have service models. From a DevOps perspective, we now are focusing on the application models. And when we release, then we have software models. So these are going to be very important objects. They are referential on every single CI. So at the core CMDB CI, model ID is the reference to the product model table. So what does that relate to on all of the objects inside of the CMDB? Historically, discovery runs and for the most part populates or creates and populates the models on a large amount of the things that it finds out in the environment. But then we want to make sure we focus on everything else because those product models are going to give us some important visibility. I want you to understand what that visibility is going to be. When it comes to the hierarchy of product models, there is a product model table, CMDB_model. It is not part of the CMDB, even though it has CMDB in the label, unfortunately. And there are multiple types. We have an application model, which is an application without version details. It is version agnostic. It is the parent, so to speak. When you go to release applications, so from a DevOps perspective, you will then have versions of some sort or release numbers. Those are software models. Software models are version specific or release specific. These are the children of application models. So those two objects become extremely important to us with our build domain and our SDLC component class, because we are going to be identifying that SDLC component tied to an application model. When we go to release to our application services are actually going to be referencing a software model because it's a version of something that's been released. Other pieces that are types of product models, more asset related contracts, facility, hardware, consumable, we're going to be focused on service model. So with these particular elements, again, we've been referencing these for a while. Today, you already reference them on assets, CIs, contracts, epics, and stories. In the future, we're adding these as referential objects to ideas, demands, projects, and all tasks. So if you were to go in and you look at these pieces today, you see that there is a model ID that is on all of your CIs. It's one of the critical attributes, and it references that product model table. So each of these types are classes of a product model. So we are going to be moving towards utilizing these more and more. I present that today as just to inform you that it's going to be important. In the San Diego release, we're actually trying to fill in the model ID for you for your CIs in the classes we consider to be important, which are going to be all of the service classes, business services, technical services, service offerings, and application services. We'll also fill in the model ID for the business applications. So we're going to head start. So if you're already out there and don't feel that you have to populate all these things on your own suddenly, in the San Diego release, we're going to do it for you. And then after that, we're going to have some capabilities. They're going to look at that product model and start to tell you details about that product as you manage products and identify how it is functioning throughout its life. So just a piece for the future. It's going to be important. And we added it to the CSDM in our release 3. It's going to be more and more important for the future. So as we look at how we would implement in the future, based off of CSDM 4, not much changes. We still have foundation. We added a SDLC component to crawl, but it is optional. You don't have to use it. If you don't see a need to break your business applications into pieces and parts, which are their own developed components, don't worry about it. If you're not worried about microservices right now, don't worry about it. But in the future, when you start to get worried about microservices, this is going to be there for you to use. It's going to be there so that you can identify that business application broken up into parts. If you start to focus on DevOps in the future, it's going to be there as a critical element of DevOps, and it's going to just be built into the process to be used and functioning. In the walk phase, now service portfolio can be related to technical services. Previously, it was in the run phase because it could only be related to a business service, but now we don't have to wait. So service portfolio can now be part of the walk stage. And then, of course, run is still the same, fly is still the same. So not much changes aside from the fact that we got some new capabilities and there's no rush to use them. And that is it. Questions?
I just want to say that was amazing, Scott, as always. Thank you so much. And there's been a couple requests to make the PowerPoint presentation available post this office hour. So if you could send that to me, and then we could probably post it on the community, or we could figure out a way just to get it to the guests that attended this session personally, that'll be great as well. But just kudos to you for that. Definitely opening up the floor for any customers that have any questions for Scott about CSDM that weren't asked and answered during the chat window. So go ahead first. Looks like Molly, you're up.
Yeah, sorry. Can you go back to, I think it's slide 26, Scott, your hardware lifecycle? Sorry, I just want to expand upon my question because it obviously wasn't a very clear question. So it appears that the allocate phase is missing under purchase. And the reason I mention that is because from a TBM standpoint, that's the first point at which you need to begin tracking an item, whether it's specific to an application service or an infrastructure type service that's the entity question I was basically asking. So is the
Where do
reference
we
only
identify
going?
that we've allocated it? So
Right.
there's different scenarios. And it depends on how you define allocated. So allocated are they going to take receipt or have they already taken receipt? So we have deploy recognized in here, which was not something that asset management did previously necessarily. So identifying that's part of deployment so that we can have the appropriate changes tied to these if we're using changes. That becomes the activity of where we're actually going to do the true receipt of an allocation. Prior to that, it's reserved or pre-allocated. Those two pieces can align to those functions depending on how descriptive you're getting into that allocation process.
I mean, from like a financial standpoint, from the minute you've set money aside specifically and from a TBM perspective.
Set money aside to purchase it or?
Correct. When you've designated these funds are locked down for the purchase, which will ultimately become inventory and deployed.
Okay, so that becomes workflow that's tied to asset management that isn't going to be the actual object's life cycle. So and the reason why I state that is depending on the customer, I've seen where that fiduciary responsibility occurs right at the order stage, or there's details into the fact that this has been shipped, and the second it's been shipped, that's when we take responsibility for it, or it's when we've actually received it. Those workflow elements are part of asset management and not a life cycle of this individual object at this time.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That clarifies.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we do have a question here. I've asked the participant UWE to unmute, but I'll ask just in case she can, or he or she can't do it. Any details about which application will start using new attributes? Example, ITOM or discovery, software asset management?
So using the lifecycle attributes specifically, or different attributes? The first
Yeah,
group.
sorry, I have to find my unmute button. Yeah, the question was, you mentioned from further releases, new business units will start using these attributes of fields like integrated risk management and so on. For the IT for IT suites or applications like ITOM, software asset management, when is supposed that the new attributes will related to each other seamlessly without migration paths, so that discovery populates in the right fields if possible?
So we haven't touched anything about discovery with attributes. ITOM is expected to utilize the new lifecycle stage and stage status from a licensing perspective in the San Diego release. They're still working through how they will utilize that more specifically throughout. The fact that we have the mapping exercise from legacy attributes to the new means that they aren't in a big rush to utilize the out of the box ones, because they can still reference the old ones. ITOM, as you're probably aware, has a lot of touches into that life cycle from various stages of how they look at it from a cloud perspective. And the first one that they're going to fix is licensing. Right now, they focus on operational status for their licensing purposes. So in the San Diego release, they're migrating off of operational status to determine licensing, and we'll be using the two new attributes to determine licensing on whether or not you're charged for the use of ITOM. Outside of that, they will likely be a Tokyo timeframe where they're fully using the new attributes. But internally, we had the demand that organizations start using all of this in the San Diego timeframe. In Rome, asset management is using these two new attributes on the product models. That was the first grouping to migrate and use the new attributes. And it was pretty much a kind of a smaller table set, so we could test and make sure what the processes would be to migrate internally our applications to use these two new attributes versus the longstanding legacy. So product models in Rome release are already using the two new attributes. Asset and the CMDB and the various business units are set to start using the new attributes in San Diego timeframe. But ITOM is going to take a little bit longer and likely will be towards Tokyo. And as from a CMDB perspective, as I mentioned, in Rome, they introduced a new capability, which is that CMDB data manager, and it's going to be using these right out of the gate.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I have another question that just popped up. Can we install the SDLC domain right away when they come in the store? Is there anything that we should be concerned about? Do they get installed automatically when the next release comes in?
Yeah, so it's part of the CMDB table update. So it's a standard offering up on the store, and all of our updates to the CMDB, new classes, etc., go through that. So you just look at what version is currently available. Does that match the version that you have in your environment? And the table will be a part of that update. We're looking to get it in there for the November, December at the latest, because we've got DevOps that is releasing capability in that timeframe that needs this table. So we obviously have to have it in the CMDB before that. And as you're aware, anything I mentioned in the common service data model from a table perspective is available out of box without having to license anything. So for DevOps to need to use it, that means we have to have it in there. So November, December, it'll be part of that store app that is the constant update of the CMDB.
Great. Next question.
Yeah,
Oh,
I have a follow-up question. Like, do they get installed if we don't get that update? Do they get installed automatically when the next general release comes in?
Maybe, but not always. So you really want to focus on having that store app to make sure that you get those things.
Oh, okay. And there's no, like, even if we have customizations, we don't have to be concerned too much about anything getting messed up, right?
No, because what that does is it makes sure what we consider to be out-of-box tables are there and present. So
Okay.
we'll be creating a table. What you have as customization is likely a U underscore, so it doesn't touch anything that you have.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, good. Another question from Daniel. When will the new version of CSDM be available in ServiceNow docs, especially the new build domain?
The new white paper is going to be released in October. Once that's released, then the documentation team will be updating the docs.
Perfect. Next question. Are the location management changes already available in Rome?
They should be. That's what I was told. If they're not, let me know, because then I get to go yell at someone.
And then the last question from Johnny. When you mentioned the new SDLC tables, microservices were mentioned. Is it correct that these would be tracked as an SDLC item mapped to an application service? And so, if so, the app service CI would be available as the operational CI for IPC. And Johnny, feel free to unmute yourself if you wanted to clarify that question a little bit further.
100% yes. Everything said was correct.
Awesome. All right. And Daniel just replied, thanks for the response to his question. Any other last minute questions? We got 2 more minutes with the great Scott. So any last minute questions or just general feedback or comments? Sounds like everyone's very excited about CSDM 4.0. I see a lot of good feedback in the chat window here. So looks good. Any other questions, my friends out there? Well, definitely for those there, I launched an office hour feedback poll. Please fill that out as well before you log off. Go ahead, Johnny.
Yeah, sorry. I figured you just to straight ask this. So I guess the question I have then, right, following up on the SDLC question. So what's the value in having the SDLC component in addition to the application service? Like where would you use the SDLC component where you wouldn't use the application service if they sort of represent the same thing? I guess is where my question comes in at.
So they don't represent the same thing. The SDLC component is going to be tied to DevOps. So it's going to have visibility into the effort to design and build that particular element to be released. So understanding what is the fact that something was recently released, understanding the details of what was released, what was the code, what was everything that went into it. A release might not be singular. It might be a bundle of multiple things that were released at once.
So
one of which is related to that component.
Sorry, so would the intention be to, I guess, use the SDLC component as tracking on the release module, but then your incident problem change would track it via the actual application service that's deployed?
Correct, because the application service is the operational function entity, where the SDLC component is your build domain.
I got it. Okay, that makes sense now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you're concerned with DevOps, then SDLC component is perfect. It's exactly what you want to see. If you're not concerned with DevOps, we're not forcing everyone to use SDLC component. So we don't want people to think that it's a duplicate of an application service and we're just filling this out because ServiceNow said to, and so did Scott. We're not saying that. It is optional. If you want to have that visibility into DevOps and where that can impact what is operational, that's why we have that piece there.
Great stuff. And just one final question here from Matthew Smith. Will there be any working examples of SDLC components to supplement the version 4.0 white paper?
Yes, they might not be immediate, but yes. And that's something that Mark Bodman is working on. We have put together a YouTube channel so we can have some real short, concise trainings on very specific topics, including examples of CSDM, whether it's 3.0 or 4.0. And so those will be put up there and they'll work through use cases that customers have given us, use cases that we've worked through. So we'll have multiple pieces that go up there. Just takes time, but they'll definitely be there.
Awesome. All right. And just some great overall feedback at the bottom. Any other last minute questions? Okay. Well, as always, thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, customers, for joining. For those watching the video, thank you for watching the video. I hope you guys have a great Friday and an awesome weekend. Take care, everyone. And the recording should be up by Monday on the community side. Take care. Bye-bye.